Welcome to Snooze and Muse, the place where history slows down and stories unfold softly, one chapter at a time. Tonight, we sail into the quiet heart of the North Atlantic, where a ship of dreams glided through the stars, unaware that the sea was waiting. This is the story of the RMS Titanic, not just as steel and steam, but as a vessel of human hope, of love, of silence, and of final goodbyes. So, settle in. Let the world fade, and drift back in time to A Night Lit by starlight and a name that would echo forever. Chapter 1. The ocean's crown in the shipyards of Belfast. The fog hung low, curling through the iron lattice of scaffolding like breath in winter air. The year was 1909, and something extraordinary was beginning. Amid the echo of hammers and the hiss of steam, a dream began to take shape, not one of myth or imagination, but one forged from steel. Her name would be Titanic, and before long, she would become the most famous ship in human history. Titanic wasn't just a project. She was an idea, a vision born in boardrooms and steel mills, whispered about in aristocratic circles and shouted across smoky docks. The White Star Line had imagined something unmatched. Titanic would be the largest moving object ever built by man, not only an engineering marvel, but a floating symbol of progress, power, and luxury. She would connect continents and carry dreams. Belfast had seen ships before, but none like this. Harland and Wolff shipyards, already respected for their scale and precision, now found themselves tasked with building what many already called the Ship of Dreams. Workers arrived each morning with soot-stained hands and coal-dark eyes, stepping into a living maze of beams, bolts, and rising decks. Their labor was hard, unrelenting, but the goal was clear: to bring Titanic to life. Each rivet they hammered was a heartbeat, each steel plate a skin. Her skeleton stretched across the docks, visible even from distant hillsides. Children pointed to her with awe. Journalists scribbled stories about her speed and size. And still she grew. She grew until her shadow blanketed Belfast. Steel and steam, elegantly forged Titanic, was a masterpiece of balance between might and grace, industry and art. She measured 882 feet in length and towered over the harbor. She weighed over 46,000 tons, yet she moved with elegance. Inside, no detail was too small. Everything was intentional. Everything whispered class. Her construction spanned more than 2 years. Over 3 million rivets held her together, each driven by hand and machine. Her hull, double-bottomed for safety, was crafted to resist impact. Her rudder alone weighed 101 tons. Titanic's engines were among the most powerful ever made. And yet, within this fortress of steel, one found silence and softness. First-class staterooms glowed with mahogany paneling and silk drapes. Grand staircases wound upward like vines of gold. The Caf Parisian, modeled after Parisian sidewalk cafes, brought European flair to the Atlantic. Marble fireplaces, Turkish baths, electric elevators, all placed carefully into the ship's heart. Titanic was not built to move, she was built to impress. But her true beauty lay in the paradox. A machine so vast and complex, yet tenderly designed for comfort. Her decks stretched wide, her promenade long enough for morning strolls. Her dining rooms gleamed with glassware and china. And in every hallway, the glow of electric light, a rare thing in 1912. More than anything, she felt alive. Not like a machine, but like a place. A floating palace, shaped by the hands of ordinary men and the dreams of an extraordinary age, a promise of splendor from the moment she was announced. Titanic was more than a ship. She was a promise. The White Star Line called her practically unsinkable. Newspapers echoed the phrase, embedding it into the public mind. In her name, they saw the future. Powerful, beautiful, safe. Her launch was not just an event, it was a spectacle. Thousands gathered to watch her kiss the water for the first time. As she slid down the slipway, cheers rose like waves themselves. And once afloat, Titanic became an icon. Advertisements called her the height of travel. Brochures painted her as paradise at sea. Artists rendered her with wings and halos. And society believed it. First-class passengers booked suites that rivaled any hotel. Second-class travelers found rare dignity. Even third class, usually ignored, discovered private cabins and clean linens. Titanic was supposed to be the great equalizer, but expectations carry weight. And behind the elegance stood a reality often ignored. Lifeboats were few, just enough for half the people on board. Safety drills were minimal, and warnings from the sea, though sent, were dismissed. The myth of invincibility was already forming. Cracks. Still, none of this could be seen from the dock. Not on April 10, 1912, when Titanic readied herself for her maiden voyage. That morning, the sun rose over Southampton. The docks buzzed with excitement. Porters hauled trunks. Horses pulled carriages. And somewhere among the noise, a soft wind rustled the flags that flew from her towering masts. The maiden voyage begins at exactly 12 o'clock noon, Titanic's horn bellowed. Low, powerful, final. A voice that seemed to say, "Now we go." Lines were cast. Gangways pulled back. And slowly, gracefully, Titanic slipped away from land. More than 2,200 people were on board. Men in top hats. Women in velvet gowns. Children with paper dolls. Some were millionaires. Others were farmers. Some were heading home. Others chasing a new beginning. But all had placed their trust in her. On deck, passengers waved to the crowds. Left behind. Some threw flowers. Some stood quietly. Below, engines throbbed with strength, propelling the ship forward at a steady pace. The river opened into the sea, and the sea welcomed her as Titanic sailed into the English Channel. Sunlight shimmered on her windows. Inside, stewards directed guests to their rooms. Bellboys carried luggage. Musicians tuned instruments. Chefs prepped meals with fine cutlery. The world within Titanic moved with rhythm and charm. The voyage felt perfect. The ship hardly swayed. Seagulls circled her funnels. And as she passed the Isle of Wight, the last glimpse of England faded behind. Her ahead, Cherbourg, Queenstown, and finally, New York. In those first hours, Titanic was exactly what she promised to be: serene, grand, unforgettable. A ship not racing against time, but floating above it, and no one on board, not even the most cautious, could have imagined that this journey would not be remembered for its luxury or design, but for its loss. Chapter 2, Passengers of Fate. At the very top of Titanic's grand design, floated its most luxurious world first class. This was the realm of wealth, prestige, and polished grace. It was where the Astors strolled beneath gold-plated sconces, where the Whittiners dined on crystal and china, and where elegance wasn't a luxury, it was expected. Their lives did not pause aboard the ship. Instead, they simply moved their social calendars onto the sea. Their suites felt less like cabins and more like apartments, complete with drawing rooms, private promenades, and servants on call. The furniture was upholstered in fine fabrics. The bathrooms tiled with imported ceramics. Some rooms boasted fireplaces not for heat, but for charm. It was here that the Titanic wore her most extravagant face. From the grand staircase with its wrought iron railings to the reading rooms that smelled of leather and pipe smoked out in the dining saloon, meals were more like ceremonies. 10 courses. Courses timed like the turning of a watch. Men wore black tailcoats. Women wore pearls and feathers. A soft quartet played nearby. Conversations floated through the air, as calm and measured as the waves outside. The elite did not rush. They did not worry. They believed the Titanic was as permanent as their status, and for those few days, it felt that way. On deck, they played shuffleboard. In the lounge, they read from embossed books. And at night, they returned to rooms turned down by stewards. Their beds warmed with hot water bottles and a sense of absolute security. Titanic for them was not a journey. It was a pause in a life of privilege, a floating estate that obeyed no schedule but their own. The second-class middle beneath the grand halls of first class lay another world quieter, but no less full of stories. Second class was the space of professionals, teachers, clerks, and tourists. They were neither the lords of wealth nor the laborers of hope. They were, in many ways, the most like the listener people trying to move forward with dignity and pride. Their cabins were smaller, but comfortable, with polished wood, clean linens, and shared baths. There was no opulence, but there was order. Passengers like Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher, walked the decks with notebooks in hand, observing, reflecting. For them, Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol of having made it. Meals in second class were simpler than those above, but still refined. Roast meats, fresh fruit, warm bread. The dining room was bright with white linens and modest flowers. There were conversations about politics, books, and the marvel of this great ship. They had the privilege to board. Children of second-class passengers explored wide hallways with cautious excitement. Their parents, often caught between ambition and responsibility, kept watchful eyes. Some were moving to America for opportunity. Others were returning from vacation. All believed they had found a rare moment of comfort between the classes above and below. Titanic offered them not fantasy, but recognition, a moment to feel seen in a world that often overlooked the in-between. Below deck, a different rhythm. Deeper still, down narrow staircases and through long white corridors, was steerage third class. Here, the air smelled of iron, soap, and sea. But it also carried something else, hope. These were the passengers who came not for leisure, but for life itself. Immigrants, families, widows and young men with suitcases of tools. Their dreams did not glitter, they burned. Third-class cabins were plain, shared among groups of 4 to 10, depending on the arrangement. Bunk beds lined the walls, and the hum of the ship was ever present. Yet even in these modest rooms, Titanic was generous compared to most liners. There was running water, clean sheets, and proper ventilation. Luxuries not always found at sea.by day. Children laughed and played in the open spaces near the stern. Mothers cooked simple meals or braided hair by the light of portholes. Songs from Ireland, Sweden, and Italy drifted from cabins, a soft chorus of cultures crossing together. In the evenings, dances would begin, fiddles, clapping, and the occasional stomping of boots against steel floors. They were not there to pass time, they were there to begin something. A new home in America. A chance to start over. And as they sailed, many wrote letters they could not yet send, or whispered to sleeping children about what waited at journey's end. Third class did not envy the levels above them. They looked forward, not upward. And in that hope they carried a quiet power, a human mosaic at sea. Titanic was divided by class. Her passengers were all part of a single story, even if they never crossed paths. She became a city on water, and like every city, she held layers, towers, middle floors, and crowded basements. But the ocean made them equal in its own silent way, on the same decks where millionaires admired sunsets, children from steerage watched the sea for the first time. In the same nights where violinists played for ballroom guests, lullabies were sung below deck. Across her steel corridors moved over 2,000 lives, unaware of the destiny that waited. Some passengers wrote diary entries. Some snapped photographs. Some kept entirely to themselves. But all were bound by this strange moment in time. 4 days aboard a ship that seemed too vast to fail, Titanic carried joy and sorrow, laughter and silence, wealth and want all within her walls. And though she divided people by price, the sea would remember them together. It would carry their names, not their titles, their voices, not their fortunes, and in this quiet space between departure and arrival, Titanic held them not as passengers, but as a portrait of the world itself. Chapter 3. A gentle crossing. For several days after her departure, the Titanic sailed smoothly across the Atlantic. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally so. Gentle waves lapped against her hull without force, barely leaving a trace. The sky remained mostly clear, dotted with white clouds that drifted lazily above. It was the kind of weather sailors prayed for, and passengers cherished. The great ship moved forward with quiet confidence. On deck, guests wrapped in shawls and wool coats leaned against the railings, letting the wind brush their faces. Couples took slow walks, exchanging quiet laughter. Children chased each other past the deck chairs. Older men played cards under awnings, their cigars leaving trails of smoke in the open air. Inside, the hum of life continued. In the writing rooms, pens scratched over crisp paper as passengers described the ship, the meals, and the stillness of the water to loved ones far away. In the lounges, tea was poured in porcelain cups. Gentle music flowed from pianos, and newspapers from Paris or London were passed between gloved hands. The ship felt untouchable. There were no sudden movements, no worries in the air. The Titanic's strength inspired trust. Its size comforted those uneasy about crossing an ocean. Each passing hour felt suspended, like time itself was resting. There was no sign, no warning. Only silence and routine. And yet, the calmness carried the soft rhythm of something waiting, just beyond the horizon. Voices on the water. Titanic was alive with sound, though most of it passed unnoticed. The tap of shoes on marble floors, the clink of cutlery in dining halls, the rustle of paper in libraries. But deeper underneath it all were voices not loud, not clear, but present. A tea at table in the first-class reading room. A man underlined passages in a leather-bound novel. His wife sipped her tea and watched the sea. Neither spoke, but there. Silence held years of understanding. Near the rail, a second-class teenager whispered to her sister, too softly to be heard. She was asking about America, about the dresses they might wear, the jobs they might find. The older sister only smiled, not answering with words. In the third-class promenade, a little boy asked his father why the water looked so black. The father didn't reply. He just picked him up and pointed at the stars. Some wrote about the ship, how big it was, how new. Others wrote about what they missed: gardens, neighbors, routines. Their letters were filled with small details: the smell of the sea, the comfort of warm bread, the quiet wonder of drifting. If the Titanic had ears, she would have heard it all. The hopes, the worries, the plans. Words written down. Thoughts never spoken. Promises made beneath the sky. All of it held quietly in her walls, like a whisper the ship would take with her. The ice warning sent April 14th. The Marconi wireless room received several messages from nearby ships. They were brief, ordinary in tone, but carried weight. Ice was ahead, the note said. Large fields of it. Bergs. Drifting floes. Coordinates were shared. The operators, busy transmitting passengers' personal messages, took down the warnings. Some were passed along to the bridge. Others were logged and set aside. There was no urgency in the voices that sent them. No panic in the replies. At the time, ice was not unusual in northern waters. It was expected during this part of the crossing, especially in spring. Titanic's officers noted the reports and adjusted slightly. But they did not change course. Some ice warnings were delivered to Captain Smith. Others were posted in the chart room. But no general alert was issued. No meeting was called. There was confidence in the ship's ability to handle what lay ahead. After all, she was unsinkable, or so they believed. That afternoon, the Californian radioed again with details of heavy ice. The operator aboard Titanic, overwhelmed by the backlog of messages, snapped in frustration and told the Californians, "Man to be quiet." The message was lost in static. By evening, the air had grown colder. Those on deck noticed their breath, but the stars still shone. The sea remained flat. The engines continued their rhythm. The warnings were now part of the ship's log, not her soul. Night falls gently as the sun dipped behind the horizon on April 14th, 1912. A kind of hush fell across the ship. The sky turned indigo, then the navy, then black. The stars emerged, sharp and countless. There was no moon, only starlight bright enough to reflect on the sea like silver. The Atlantic, so often restless, had become perfectly still. No wind, no waves, just silence. Some passengers called it beautiful, others unsettling. The ship moved without resistance, cutting through glass. Lights twinkle from the portholes. Shadows moved behind curtains. Somewhere a final waltz played. The dining rooms had emptied. The decks were quiet. In the cabins, clothes were folded. Prayers whispered. Shoes tucked neatly beneath beds. Some passengers wrote a last note before going to sleep. Others stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the engines. Captain Smith visited the bridge. He spoke with officers. Everything seemed in order. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, but the night was clear, the view unobstructed. There was no reason to worry. At 11:30 p.m., most of the ship was asleep. The ship's course was steady. The lookout stood in the crow's nest, eyes scanning the Black Sea for any sign of danger. The bells did not ring, and the Titanic continued forward, not knowing that just minutes ahead, an iceberg waited, silent and still, beneath the stars. Chapter 4. Collision Course. The night was still, so still it felt like the world had stopped turning. The ocean stretched out flat and black, smooth as a pane of glass. Overhead, stars glimmered sharp, steady, and impossibly close. The moon had not risen, and in its absence, shadows deepened. On the bridge, the crew watched and waited, calm in the quiet rhythm of passage. It was 11:39 p.m. Up in the crow's nest, two lookouts peered ahead, their breath fogging in the cold air. Their eyes strained into the darkness, alert for the shimmer of ice. The North Atlantic was quiet to quiet, and the ship moved forward at nearly top speed. Then it appeared, a shape pale against the Black Sea, rose like a silent mountain from nothing. No sound announced it. No swell warned of its presence. Just a pale shadow, still and waiting, directly in the ship's path. A ghost made of ice, iceberg right ahead. Came the cry. Below, the bridge snapped into motion. Orders were shouted. The wheels spun hard. Engines reversed. But a ship that large doesn't turn quickly. Titanic's massive body fought against the change, her weight pushing forward, her course already written in steel. For a breathless moment, it looked as if she might miss it. The ship veered to port. The iceberg loomed on the starboard side. Too close, too silent. And then, not a crash, not an explosion, but something quieter. A sound like tearing cloth. A long, slow scrape. The iceberg's submerged edge brushed against Titanic's hull. The wound was made beneath the waterline, jagged and deep across 5 compartments. The sea, calm and cold, began to pour in on deck. Few noticed. The night seemed unchanged. The ship sailed on, but beneath the surface, everything had shifted. Impact at 11:40 p.m. Deep in the boiler rooms, men felt something odd. A vibration. A subtle tremor, like the ship had passed over gravel. Pipes rattled. A few valves hissed. Then came a jolt, soft but wrong. Not loud, but long dot in the darkness. Lanterns swayed. Coal buckets tipped. Steam hissed from unexpected places. Some crew looked up. Others moved toward the forward bulkhead already. Water was rising dot in the bow. Men reached for tools. Pumps were activated. Watertight doors slid shut with a hiss and thud. But the Atlantic had already entered. Cold, relentless, it surged. In low and fast on the upper decks, most passengers felt nothing. Some paused in their reading. A few glanced up from card games or dinner plates. In their staterooms, guests stirred slightly, then settled again. The scrape had sounded like something passing below. Perhaps an anchor being lowered. Perhaps ice brushed aside. There was no panic. No alarm. The music continued in the lounge. Glasses clinked. Doors closed. The ship continued on her way, but down below, in the heart of the ship, the reality was beginning to unfold. Steel plates had buckled. Seams had split. Water was where it should not be in coal bunkers, in cargo. Holds, pushing its way into space after space. The men who worked there didn't need to be told. They saw it, felt it, touched it with bare hands. The Titanic was wounded, and time, once steady and sure, began to quicken. Denial and delay on the bridge. Officers moved briskly, but quietly. The ship had struck something that was certain. But the scale of the damage wasn't yet clear. Orders were given too slow. Doors were checked. Messages sent below. Lights stayed on. Soon, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, arrived. Calm, composed. He walked the length of the damage. And as he studied the rising water, the tilt in the floor, the path of flooding, a quiet truth settled in. The Titanic was doomed, but on deck, the mood had not changed. Passengers asked questions, but received careful answers. Just a precaution. There's no danger. It's nothing serious. In the lounges, men returned to their brandy. Women to their books. Children stayed in bed. Lifeboats were not discussed. Crew moved calmly. There were no sirens. No announcements beneath. That surface, though, the truth grew colder. Some passengers began to notice the ship leaning ever so slightly forward. Floors no longer perfectly level. Doors closing strangely. But these were details small, dismissible. A few were told to dress, just in case. Some were given life belts. But still, the tone remained light. It was too large to sink. Too modern. Too new. This was the Titanic, and so denial did its quiet work. It bought time not for safety, but for delay, and in that delay, the water climbed, the awakening minutes passed. Then more. The truth could no longer wait. The bow had dipped further. Below decks, water rushed with purpose. It moved through corridors, climbed stairwells, filled compartments once considered safe. Pumps groaned under the strain. Crew scrambled to redirect passengers. Stewards now urged not asked that people put on life belts and move toward. The deck, the ship's tilt became impossible to ignore. On the bridge, lifeboat orders were issued. Officers moved quickly now, checking gear, organizing lines. Still, no general alarm rang out, but word began to spread, fast and uneven, through crew whispers and second-hand warnings. Suddenly, staterooms were filled with motion. People dressed. Hurriedly, confused, anxious. Some gathered what they could carry: coats, jewelry, photos. Others left everything behind. Outside, lifeboats were uncovered. The cold bit harder now. The air had sharpened. The stillness of earlier was gone. It had been replaced by murmurs, shouts, the scraping of lifeboat davits turning. Families held hands. Friends separated in the crowd. Crew shouted instructions, some heard, some not. The ship was still lit, but its glow now felt eerie, a floating. City realizing at last it was sinking. Below, the truth had already arrived. The water had reached boiler rooms and crew quarters. Floors once walked were now drowned. The deepest parts of the ship belonged to the sea, and the ship, once proud, once impossible, began to feel different underfoot. Every second ticked louder. Every movement more urgent. The Titanic had been struck, not by a loud, crashing blow, but by something slower, quieter, colder, and now there was no stopping what had begun. The unsinkable ship had met its hour, and the clock was counting down. Chapter 5. A ship divided. In the minutes after the iceberg tore its quiet wound along Titanic's hull, confusion settled like mist across her decks. Officers moved quickly, but without clear direction. Some issued instructions that contradicted others. Some waited for orders that never came. And in the middle stood Captain Smith, a man known for calm. Now consumed by silence, he had led ships across oceans for decades. He was respected, even admired. But now, in the heart of crisis, his voice was low, his eyes far away. He knew the truth. Titanic was sinking. But saying it out loud felt like betrayal to the ship, to her makers, and to the faith of every soul on board. Below deck, the crew moved through narrow corridors, knocking on doors, waking passengers. Please get dressed. Bring your life vest. It's only a precaution, they said. But their eyes betrayed them. The ship had changed, and they knew it. The lights still glowed. The music had stopped, but voices carried on in small clumps of conversation. There was no alarm yet, but there was an unease, a wrongness that pulsed beneath every surface. Officers began unfastening lifeboats, exposing the ropes and pulleys that had once been hidden in plain sight. Crew whispered questions to each other. How many can we fit? When should we lower them? No one truly knew. Titanic was not meant for this moment. Her beauty had left no room for urgency. Women and children first. Order was simple. Women and children first, but the execution was anything but. It was a rule spoken with good intention, but built on assumptions. It asked people to separate, to choose, to accept that some would stay and others would go. In first class, many husbands stepped back, letting their wives and children pass. Their goodbyes were soft, even brave. Some men lit cigarettes. Some shook hands. Some just watched, but not. Everyone stepped back. In second class, the rule became harder to enforce. Questions filled the air. Where do we go? Which lifeboat? Why can't we all fit? A few officers raised their voices. Others hesitated, unsure if they had the authority to act. There were no drills, no practice runs. The lifeboats had been seen as decoration, not necessity. Now they became the only path to survival, and the order around them dissolved. In the scramble, class and position showed their weight. First-class passengers were guided, escorted, helped. Others searched alone, guessing their way to the upper decks, and when the first boats lowered, they did so with space to spare. Some passengers hesitated. "This ship can't sink," they said. "It's safer to stay aboard." The crew did not argue. They wanted obedience, not panic. So the boats dropped half-filled, drifting down into the dark, leaving behind those who still believed the ship would hold. Third class locked below, far below, in the ship's lowest decks, families in steerage woke to confusion. There were no officers at their doors. No one came to guide them. The sound of water moving through walls was louder here. Closer, when they did try to leave, they found gates. Locked, bolted, unmanned. The crew said it was for order, for safety. But for those behind the bars, it felt like abandonment. They searched for another way. Up staircases, through empty corridors. Some carried children. Others pulled trunks. They met closed doors, wrong directions, language barriers. And fear became the only thing they understood. Some found their way to second class. Others were turned back. The halls grew crowded. The tilt of the floor made walking harder. Families were separated. Voices rose in confusion and desperation. Few crew members helped opening doors, pointing the way. Others did not. The ship, once a promise of hope, now became a maze of barriers. Steerage passengers who had paid the least now paid the most in time and access and chance. Still, many pressed on. They climbed. They pushed. They believed there was a place for them too. And in that belief, they continued. The lifeboat. Problem Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Together, they could hold about 1,200 people, less than half the number on board. It had been a decision made early in her design. Lifeboats were not for everyone. They were for ferrying people to rescue. Ships, in theory. Titanic, after all, could not sink. So her decks were left wide and uncluttered. Her beauty took priority over her reality. Now the truth stood clear in the cold air. There were not enough seats, not enough ropes, not enough time. As each boat was swung out, crew members had to guess who to let in, how many to allow. The fear of capsizing led them to lower boats with empty seats. 10 here, 20 there. Space that could have saved lives, now drifting alone. Some passengers refused to board. The idea of leaving the large, warm ship for a small wooden boat felt wrong. Others begged for a spot, only to be turned away. Women held babies, staring down. At the black water, men stood beside them, silent. Some watched their loved ones descend and never looked away. Others disappeared below, unable to face the goodbye. Time passed quickly now. The bow continued to lower. The angle of the deck became more noticeable. And the lifeboats, each a thread of hope, slipped one by one into the sea. It became clear. The ship would not save them. Only the boats. And there would not be enough. Chapter 6. Into the boats. The lifeboats, hidden for days behind polished wood in gentle distractions, were finally uncovered. They hung along the sides of the Titanic like quiet guardians waiting, swinging slightly as the ship shifted. Underfoot. Until now, they had been part of the background. Decorative. Dismissible. But now, they became the center of everything. It was just after midnight. The cold had become sharp, biting through collars and coats. The stars still glimmered. Above, quiet and endless, while below, a different silence was spreading, one made of hesitation, of choices that weighed more than anyone had imagined. Along the railings, families gathered, some tightly holding hands, others trying to stay calm for the sake of children. Crew members called out softly, organizing passengers. Women and children. First, the order repeated again and again, a rule made by tradition, now becoming law by necessity. But for every family that followed, there was one that hesitated. A husband holding back as his wife was guided forward. A daughter clinging to her father's coat. A mother refusing to step into the unknown with a stranger's hands reaching for her child. The ship still felt solid beneath them. The night, so calm, made it hard to believe the urgency was real. Some men nodded with silent understanding, choosing to stay. Others protested, trying to reason with the crew, begging for one more space, one more chance. Some said goodbye quietly with a kiss on the forehead or a whispered prayer. One man lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, smiled at his wife, and stepped away from the rail. Courage did not always look heroic. It looked like stillness, like holding back tears, like helping someone into a lifeboat you could not follow Dot in. Those minutes, no one was just a passenger. They were husbands, wives, daughters, brothers, each moment becoming a memory shaped by choice. And around them, the sea waited, dark and patient, empty seats and full hearts at first. The lifeboats descended slowly and not full. The idea of leaving the ship felt absurd to many. Titanic was brightly lit, warm, familiar. The lifeboats, by comparison, looked small, exposed, and strange. The night air cut deep, and the water below seemed too quiet to fear. It didn't feel like disaster. It felt like disruption. Some boats were lowered with only a handful of people aboard. Room for 40, but carrying barely a dozen. Crew shouted for more to step in, but the crowd hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to panic, the first to believe the unbelievable. The earliest departures carried a mix of worry and reluctance. Some women wept as they left, calling out names. Others sat stiff, holding children close. Their eyes stayed on the ship as it grew taller, its lights glowing above them like lanterns in the sky. Some men, told to wait, watched as lifeboats creaked down and drifted away half empty. They clenched their fists or stared at the deck, caught between order and instinct, and still more chose to stay, to wait for clearer answers. The ship couldn't be sinking. Not yet. Not really. And so, in that uncertainty, lifeboats left the Titanic not crowded, but light, filled not with fear, but confusion, filled not with supplies, but with hearts that had just said goodbye. And above, the music continued. A waltz, perhaps. A hymn. Something gentle, rowing into darkness. Each lifeboat, once lowered, bobbed against the waves, a fragile cradle floating beneath the great ship. Oars dipped into the black water. The chill of the sea seeped into fingers and feet. Around them, the vastness of the night seemed to stretch forever. From below, the sound of rowing joined the soft murmur of voices. Some whispered, others cried. A few sat in stunned silence, their faces pale in the moonlight. Behind them, the Titanic remained. Its lights still glowed, hundreds of warm windows strung across the darkness. The shape of the deck still rose above, and from its edges, more. Boats were slowly lowered. The ship did not scream or groan. It remained graceful, glowing, even as it tilted slightly forward. From the upper decks, music drifted down like mist, a violin, a steady rhythm, a melody not quite cheerful, but strangely comforting. The band played not to calm the sea, but to calm the soul. Those in the boats looked back. No one could stop looking. The Titanic was not just a ship to them, it was home, protection, hope. To leave it felt wrong, like abandoning safety for shadow. But now it was they who drifted, and the ship that stayed behind. The further they rowed, the more unreal it became. The size of the ship seemed to grow. The sound of water became clearer. The night grew colder, and the lights, bright at first, began to dim in the distance. One by one, the small boat slipped further from her glow, widening distance as the lifeboats floated out into the vast ocean. Something changed not just in the view, but in the hearts of those watching. The distance between the boats and the ship grew slowly, but with each passing moment, it widened in a way that could not be measured by oars or ropes. Those still on the Titanic looked down at the water, watching people fade into the night. Some waved. Others stood silent. They were not strangers anymore. Every face was a story, every parting its own quiet tragedy. A mother whispered her daughter's name from the deck, long after the lifeboat was too far to hear. A man gripped the railing, straining to catch one last glimpse of the person he loved, now just a shape in the dark. There were no promises left, only space, and in the boats, eyes turned upward watching the ship that had been their world. The warm glow began to shrink. The music softened. The sounds of the crowd above grew faint, like the final echoes of a memory slipping away. It wasn't just a separation of place. It was emotional, unspoken. A quiet line drawn between those who went and those who stayed. Some of those in the boats tried to comfort each other. Others wept, not from fear, but from the knowledge that every foot of ocean between them and the ship was a goodbye, and above them, the stars shone down, cold and constant. Time stretched thin. The Titanic stood still, and the silence between them grew. And no words could close it, only memory could. Chapter 7. The band played on in the darkness of the North Atlantic, where the sea stretched wide and still. Something unexpected floated across the cold air. Music, soft and clear, it drifted between the lifeboats and the decks, wrapping around the rising fear like a gentle thread. The band played. They did not play for celebration, nor for applause. There was no audience, no curtain to close, no stage to step off. And yet, in that moment, they became something more than musicians. They became a kind of anchor, steady, human, brave. As the ship tilted slightly forward, and voices began to rise in worry, the band gathered once again on the open deck. Violins, a cello, a piano nearby. Instruments held with trembling hands, but played with a calm that defied the hour. The music wasn't loud, but it carried. A waltz at first. Something familiar, maybe even cheerful, not to deny the danger, but to hold it back, to slow its arrival. Around them, crew members shouted instructions, and the machinery of survival creaked into motion. But the notes continued, a melody over chaos, a hush beneath the shouting. People paused to listen. Mothers holding children, fathers adjusting life belts, strangers clasping hands. For a few moments, the fear softened. The melody reminded them of warmth, of rooms filled with light, of dances long ago. Even as lifeboats lowered and the deck grew cold, the music stayed warm. They played because it was what they could offer, because they had no lifeboat to board, no command to follow, just strings, bows, breath, and a calling to bring peace. Where there was none, songs of surrender. As the ship's bow sank lower into the sea, the music changed. The tempo slowed. The rhythms became more solemn, more still. The night grew heavier, and the songs, too, began to carry the weight of what was coming. Among the melodies, some would later say they heard autumn. Others remembered nearer, my God. To thee. We may never know the exact final piece, but we know how it felt, like a prayer sung through instruments, like farewell wrapped in sound. The notes reached across the decks and down into the hearts of those left behind. It wasn't just music anymore. It was comfort. It was surrender. Not to fear, but to grace. A woman, stepping into a lifeboat, stopped when she heard the first line of the hymn. She held her child closer, kissed his head, and whispered the words. A man, alone at the rail, took off his hat. Not for the band, but for the moment. The melody held space for him, and for everyone like him. The musicians did not stop. They played through the wind, through the tilt of the deck, through the tears of strangers. Their music wrapped around those who had accepted what was to come. For some, it was the last thing they heard. A violin lifting into the sky. A final note, trembling before silence. And no song could save them. But the songs became something else, a way of saying goodbye without panic. A soft, beautiful surrender to the sea, witness to courage. The music wasn't the only bravery that night. All around the ship, courage bloomed in quiet ways. Crew members ran toward danger, not away from it. They guided passengers to lifeboats, repeated calm words, steadied trembling hands. Some gave up their own life belts. Others carried children down long halls, their boots splashing in cold water. They stayed on deck until there was no more deck to stand on. One steward led a group of elderly passengers from their rooms, lifting them gently, smiling with each step. Another, waist-deep in water, shouted for people to climb as the staircase vanished behind him. These were not heroes in the traditional sense. They had no weapons, no cheers, only choices made again and again in the dark among the passengers. Courage took many forms. A woman helped strangers into lifeboats before stepping in herself. A man, told he could board, stepped back to allow another through. Parents stayed behind so their children might survive. Friends promised to find each. Other again, knowing they would not die in the final hours. The ship became something more than steel and glass. It became a place of selflessness, of decency, of moments that history would never fully capture, but always feel, even as the angle of the deck grew sharper, even as the cold crept into bones. There were hands offered, tears wiped, prayers whispered. And through it all, the music never stopped. It played not to drown the fear, but to honor the courage around it. Moments that echo. The deck was tilting sharply now. Lifeboats had all but vanished into the night. The crowd thinned. Cold air sliced through coats and breath. And still the band played, one by one. The musicians adjusted their positions, holding onto railings, leaning into the ship's angle. They played without looking at each other now. Their focus was outward to the sea, to the stars, to the faces still gathered. There was no curtain call, no final bow. Just a last piece, played into the wind. A waltz, perhaps. A hymn. A tune older than any one of them. A violin string snapped, a final note trembled, and then the music ended. But it did not vanish. It echoed not through speakers or recordings, but through time, through memory, through the hearts of those who listened that night, and those who listened later, in stories told and retold. To this day, when we speak of the Titanic, we speak of the band, not because they were famous, not because they survived, but because they stayed. Because they played, they turned fear into music, panic into grace. Their final concert was not one of applause. It was one of reverence, and in that reverence, they became eternal. Chapter 8. The final tilt. The front of the Titanic, once proud and pointed toward the horizon, now sank deeper with each passing moment. The bow lowered gently at first, then with unmistakable intent. The ship was surrendering to the sea, water. Crept through the corridors like a thief, unnoticed at first, then everywhere. It climbed staircases that once carried laughter. It slipped under doors, poured through grates, licked the edges of rugs and curtains. In the salons, armchairs floated from their places, bobbing gently as if waking from a dream, the grand staircase. Once a marvel of opulence, groaned under the weight of seawater. The glass dome above it had gone dark. The chandeliers hung askew. Carpets were soaked, banisters slick. Footsteps splashed through water that deepened by the minute, cabins filled. Quietly, sinks overflowed. Hallways tilted. The once smooth floor now slopped at an angle that made walking difficult, then dangerous. People clung to walls, to furniture, to each other. Still, there was no sudden collapse. No rush of terror. Only the slow, creeping realization that the Titanic was no longer level and would never be again. The sea had begun its slow reclaiming of the ship. And the ship, for all its strength and splendor, had no answer, last goodbyes as the bow dipped further and the stern lifted ever so slightly. Moments of farewell began to form in corners, on benches, at railings. Some passengers cried softly, holding each other beneath the lifeboat davits. Others whispered promises they could not keep. A mother wrapped a blanket tighter around her child. A husband handed his wife a ring, not with ceremony, but with resignation. On the upper deck, friends hugged without speaking. Eyes closed, foreheads touched. The past did not matter. The future was no longer a promise. What remained was only. Now a stretch of seconds where love and loss lived side by side. Time lost its meaning. Minutes felt like hours. The sky remained clear, and the stars still watched. But below them, lives pressed against each other in silence. One man removed his hat and placed it on another's head. A final gesture of warmth. Another gave away his overcoat, knowing he wouldn't need it. There were few words. None were wasted. In those final exchanges, humanity showed itself not through panic, but through connection. Titanic's last chapter was being written not only in disaster, but in dignity. The break the ship's lights flickered. A humming noise swelled deep within her hull. The groan of metal echoed up through the decks long, low and mournful. Titanic had reached her breaking point. She was now angled steeply. The bow fully submerged. The stern lifted into the air, higher by the minute. On deck, passengers slid downward. Some crawled. Others clung to railings. Still, some stood quietly, as if waiting for the sea to call them by name. Then, with a thunderous crack, the ship split. It was not a clean break. It tore. Metal shrieked. Decks collapsed inward. Smoke and sparks burst into the night. The stern rocked back, momentarily settling as if pausing to remember what it had once been. Then silence. The lights, remarkably, stayed on for a moment. Longer. Flickering. Glowing. Then, one by one, they failed. The final beacon of man's achievement blinked out into darkness. Where once stood the world's grandest ship, now stood only a broken shadow, half sunken, half skybound, waiting. For the final breath, descent into darkness. Stern lingered for a moment longer, high above the water. Then it began to fall. It went not with elegance, but with inevitability. A slow tip forward, then faster, and faster still. The sea opened wide, ready to claim what remained. People clung to railings as the deck dropped beneath their feet. Others slipped, fell, or leapt into the icy black. Some still held hands. Others braced themselves in silence. Then, with a roar muffled by water, the stern plunged beneath the surface. Bubbles exploded. Debris rose. For a brief moment, the sea danced with the wreckage chairs, wood, cloth, all spinning and sinking. Then it calmed, and just like that, Titanic was gone. There was no more steel, no more music, no more light, just the open Atlantic. Cold, dark. Still, the ship that defied storms, that embodied a new century, now belonged to the ocean quiet. Unseen, and still holding the stories of over 2,000 souls. Chapter 9. In the water, the great ship had vanished. The lights were gone. The music gone. What remained was water. And people. Hundreds of them, floating, drifting, struggling. The North Atlantic in April is not just cold, it is cruel. The temperature of the water that night was near freezing, just above 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that pierces clothes in seconds and skin in minutes. Life vests kept the bodies afloat. But nothing kept the warmth in. They floated close together at first. Voices called out. Some held hands. Others reached toward lifeboats that had already passed. But soon the shock of the cold took hold. It was not dramatic. It was quiet breath. Shortened. Muscles stiffened. Limbs stopped moving. One by one, people drifted into stillness. Their heads tipped back. Their eyes turned to stars. They could no longer see dot in the dark. There were no markers. No ship. No land. Only water. And silence. What had once been a voyage of luxury had become a sea of shadows. They were not gone in a moment. It was slower than that. A gentle surrender to the cold, minute by minute, crying out first. The night was filled with noise. Cries for help. Calls for loved ones. Prayers. Screams. The sounds of those who knew the lifeboats were out there and hoped someone might turn back. The water echoed with desperation. Mothers called for children. Husbands shouted names. Strangers yelled toward. Unseen lights, the lifeboats scattered around the wreck site, could hear it all. The voices reached across the waves, bouncing off the still surface. But the people in the boats were told to wait, to row away. To stay safe, there was fear of capsizing, of being swarmed, of dying too, and so they waited, and the voices began to fade. One by one, quieter, shorter, less frequent, not because the distance grew, but because the people did. Not survive within 20 minutes. The water had done its work. Fewer voices. Then just a few. Then only one. Then none. What followed was a silence so vast it pressed against the sky. The ocean held them now. And the night kept their names. The sky watches above all of it. The sky remained bright and clear. The stars shone just as they had before the collision. Cold and still and endless, the moon, nearly full, watched without emotion. Its light reflected. On the surface of the water, catching the edges of lifeboats, glinting off soaked life vests, constellations arched overhead, ancient and unchanged. They had watched over kings and sailors. Now they looked down on the greatest maritime disaster of the modern age and did not blink. Survivors in the lifeboats stared upward, some unable to look at the water. Their eyes found comfort in the familiar shapes. Orion, the Big Dipper. Silent witnesses to a tragedy unfolding beneath them. Time passed strangely in that silence. Minutes stretched. Hours blurred. The stillness of the sky made the suffering. Below feel even more profound. No clouds. No rain. No wind. Just an open sky and a frozen sea. And the memory of thousands suspended between them. A lifeboat turns back out of all the lifeboats launched from the Titanic. only one returned to search for survivors, Lifeboat 14, led by 5th Officer Harold Lowe. After organizing the passengers in nearby boats and distributing people to reduce weight, Lowe turned his boat around. He knew the danger, the cold, the risk of panic. But he and his small crew rowed back into the wreck site into the darkness where the ship had gone down and where hundreds had cried out. By the time they reached the area, the sea was quiet, bodies floated, lit only by starlight. Life vests bobbed gently. The sound of the oars cut through the still water. Lowe called out, hoping for an answer. He found only a few. 4 people were pulled from the water alive. One died before dawn. The rest, those who had called, who had hoped, who had waited, were gone. But that one boat had turned back. It had searched. It had answered. And in doing so, it left behind a legacy, not of survival, but of courage. Chapter 10. The Carpathia Arrives. The sky began to change. After a long, star-filled night, the blackness softened. The horizon, once endless and empty, gained the faintest shade of gray, and then a silhouette. Was small at first, distant, like a smudge on the sea. But it grew, and with it, hope returned. The RMS Carpathia, a passenger liner en route from New York to Europe, had answered Titanic's distress call. It turned off course in the night and raced through dark, icy waters. Captain Arthur Rostron had ordered all hands to prepare extra lookouts, hot drinks, lifeboat stations ready. Now, after nearly 4 hours of sailing through a field of icebergs, Carpathia arrived. The first sign of rescue, the first promise that not everything would be lost from the lifeboats. Survivors stirred. They pointed, whispered. Some cried quietly. Others stared, too numb to speak. It was the first ship they had seen since Titanic vanished beneath the sea. Carpathia moved slowly, carefully, the sea around her littered with ice and debris. But she came, and with her, light returned to a night filled with darkness, pulling. Survivors from the seethe work of rescue began immediately. Ropes were lowered. Crewmen reached down. Lifeboats drew alongside, one after another. Frozen hands gripped wooden rails. Blankets were wrapped around shoulders. Cups of coffee, tea, and brandy were passed into shivering fingers. No one asked for tickets. No one asked for rank. They simply asked, "Are you all right?" And then they helped, one by one. The boats were emptied. Survivors climbed or were lifted aboard. Some walked. Some were carried. Children were passed upward into the arms of strangers. Every lifeboat told a different story. Who was inside, who had been lost. Some survivors looked behind them, out over the empty water, as if waiting for one more lifeboat. Others refused to speak. Their eyes said everything. A few who had been pulled from the sea directly. Those few who had survived in the water were treated quickly. But most did not speak again. The deck of the Carpathia filled with voices, with weeping, with disbelief. And still the crew worked. Another boat. Another passenger. Another story of survival, edged with loss. The sea gave no more. Grief among the Safety did not bring joy. It brought weight. Many survivors were alone. Wives without husbands. Children without parents. Friends without friends. Their bodies were aboard, but parts of their hearts had gone down with the ship. On deck, there were no celebrations. Only silence. People stared at the water or at the floor. A few sobbed uncontrollably. Others held on to a single item: a hat, a coat, a ring from someone they had loved. Cabins were offered, but many sat in the corridors instead. Afraid to sleep. Afraid to remember. Some began to speak quietly. Bits of the night spilled out. The moment the ship tilted, the last thing they heard, the name they called, the hand they held, grief moved slowly through the ship like fog. It was soft, but it touched everything. Crew members tried to be kind, but there was nothing to fix, nothing to return. Only the truth to carry. Titanic had taken over 1,500 lives, and each of the 705 saved now carried the shadow of those who had not. The list is made on board. A clerk was given a task. It was simple in idea, but impossible in meaning, a list who had survived. It began with names, spoken quietly by those on deck. Some were misspelled, some repeated, some spoken with hesitation, because even the speakers couldn't believe they were alive. The names were written down on paper, line after line. Next to them, where possible, was a detail: age, class, cabin. In some cases, only a surname was known. In others, just a child's first name. At the bottom of each list was a quiet truth. The list of the living was short. The list of the lost would be much longer. Messages were prepared for New York. Wireless operators tapped out updates through the ship's Marconi system. Families waited. The press waited. The world waited. As the Carpathia turned back toward land, she carried not just people, but history. And in her hands, folded and creased, was a list. A fragile document, but one that would become sacred. The names written on it were not just survivors. They were echoes of those who had called out into the night and lived to remember. Chapter 11. The world wakes up. The morning after Titanic vanished beneath the sea, the world remained unaware. In cities and villages across the globe, people awoke to routine. They opened curtains, brewed coffee, stepped into quiet streets. And somewhere, deep under the Atlantic, the greatest ship in the world had already disappeared, but the silence did not last long. From the Marconi room aboard the Carpathia, the first wireless telegrams were sent. Stiff-fingered operators tapped out sparse, chilling messages. Titanic had struck an iceberg. Titanic had sunk. Survivors were aboard the Carpathia. The messages moved from ship to shore, from coast to continent. Each time they were passed, they changed slightly: misspellings, confusion, disbelief. Some newspapers refused to publish the reports at first. Others ran headlines with a question mark. Titanic lost? Disaster at sea? But the truth could not be delayed. By midday, the word sunk appeared on front pages. In homes, people clutched copies of newspapers they could hardly believe. In banks, on trams, in churches, and schools, voices lowered as telegrams reached them. Titanic gone? The largest, safest, most celebrated ship ever built had vanished. On her first voyage, the world had crossed into something new. Grief in public and private grief moved across oceans just as the ship had. It arrived in ports and towns like Fogslow, thick and inescapable. In Southampton, a single city had lost more than 500 crew. Flags were lowered. Businesses closed. Families stood outside shipping offices, scanning printed lists, hoping to see names they loved. In New York, crowds gathered outside the White Star Line building. They waited in silence, staring at the doors, hoping for updates. Some brought flowers. Some carried photographs. Others simply waited, unable to do anything else. Across the world, newspapers published full-page lists of the known dead. The pages were filled with names: husbands, wives, children, captains, engineers, stewards, passengers. Church bells rang. Town halls opened their doors for public prayer. Memorials were held on street corners and in chapels. Mothers wore black. Friends held hands. Entire communities mourned, even those who had never stepped on a ship, because Titanic had not just been a ship. She had been a symbol of pride, of progress, of modern power. And now she was gone. Her loss was more than tragedy. It was personal, blame and questions, and the quiet days that followed, silence gave way to anger. And with it came questions. Why did Titanic not carry enough lifeboats? Why had the warnings of ice gone unanswered? Why had nearby ships not helped? Who was responsible for letting so many die? Public inquiries began in London, in Washington. Survivors were asked to testify. Officers, passengers, wireless operators. Names that had once been known for courage were now paired with suspicion. White Star Line officials gave statements. Shipbuilders offered explanations. Journalists unearthed missed telegrams, outdated regulations, failed decisions. Diagrams of the ship were printed in papers. The lifeboat shortage was discussed everywhere. The term unsinkable became bitter. Blame was passed like paper. Between company and captain, builder and officer, government and boardroom. No single answer could soothe the scale of the loss, but the questions kept coming, and with them, a new kind of awareness. The ocean, once seen as conquered, now reminded humanity of its depth, of its indifference. A changed century begins. Titanic did not simply sink. She shifted the world. In the days and weeks after her loss, laws changed. Shipping companies were required to carry enough lifeboats for all. International ice patrols were formed to monitor dangerous waters. Radio communications were strengthened and regulated, but even beyond legislation, something deeper shifted. A mood, an outlook. A generation that believed in steel, in speed, in size now carried a quieter truth. The Titanic became a memory not just of disaster, but of hubris. Her name appeared in poems, in sermons, in school lessons. She became a symbol of sorrow, of failure, and of the fragility that lives beneath all greatness. And yet, she remained beautiful in memory. Not because of her fall, but because of the people aboard her, their bravery, their silence, their stories. The world woke up to find itself changed. The ship was gone, but the echo of her wake stretched on, far beyond the ice, the sea, or the stars. Chapter 12. Voices that remained in the days that followed the silence, when the smoke had cleared and the sea returned to its calm. The voices of the survivors began to emerge quietly, painfully, as if afraid to disturb the dead. Reporters arrived with notebooks. Historians waited with pens ready. But the most powerful records didn't come from interviews. They came from pauses, trembling hands, and long stares into nothing. Men and women who had lived through the unthinkable stood on solid ground with hearts that still sank every time they closed their eyes. Some shared their stories openly, offering every detail as if speaking them aloud would keep the memories from haunting the night. Others barely said a word, as though survival itself had used up their share of breath. A young woman, wrapped in a blanket that never seemed warm enough, described the lifeboat tipping as hands clawed at the sides. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes did. An older man, his face lined like folded maps, told how the band played to the end and how he couldn't remember the song. One child, rescued and too young to understand, asked for his mother, Avery, mourning for weeks. No one had the heart to answer him. The survivors' testimonies weren't all the same. Some remembered certain colors, others the sounds. Some could recall the scent of the salt water. Many remembered silence. One woman said, "It was like the stars were listening, but didn't want to watch as the stories piled up, written. Down, stored, and preserved, a pattern began to form. Not in the facts, but in the feeling. These people were trying to bring back something that could not return, not the ship, not the night, not even the people they had lost. What they brought instead was truth. Heavy, bare, and trembling, they spoke not because they wanted to, but because they had to. So someone would know. So someone would remember. Haunted dreams for many survivors. The real struggle began after. They were saved. The water had not taken them, but it had changed them. At night, some heard screams that no longer existed. Others saw the same dark waves rising again and again behind their closed eyes. Sleep became a place of fear, not rest. This kind of grief is hard to name. It is not just loss, not just trauma. It is survival wrapped in sorrow. Some survivors couldn't stop seeing the faces of strangers they couldn't save. Others avoided mirrors, haunted by the question, why me? There were those who could not speak of it at all. One man, rescued from the sea, later built a quiet life. In a small town. His family said he never spoke of the ship. Not once. Not to his children. Not to his wife. And yet, every year, on the same date, he would take a long walk by the water. Alone, another woman wrote in her diary that she felt like a ghost in her own life, walking, talking, but somewhere else entirely. The sea, she wrote, did not want me. And I do not know if that is a mercy or a mistake. Some survivors carried guilt like a stone in their pocket, invisible, but heavy. They questioned the seat they took in a lifeboat, wondered if someone else should have been there. Instead, they thought about hands they did not reach for, about voices that cried out and were answered with silence. Even joy felt strange. Laughter came with shame. Celebration was edged with sorrow. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, all reminders of what others would never have. And yet, over time, many survivors did rebuild their lives. They married, worked, raised children. But inside them, something was always quiet, always watching the door, always waiting for a sound that never came. Letters from the lost long after the final flare disappeared into the cold night. Long after the final wave had passed, letters began to arrive. They came from luggage found drifting, from pockets preserved by the cold, from the depths of the ocean floor when wreckage was recovered decades later. These were voices not meant for us, but left behind for someone. One letter, found years after it was written, was addressed to a mother. The words were simple. I miss home. I'll see you soon. The handwriting was neat, hopeful. It never reached its destination. Another, folded tightly in a coat pocket, was a diary entry from a young woman on her honeymoon. She described the dining room, the sparkle of the chandeliers, the sound of the sea tapping at the windows. Everything feels like a dream, she wrote. Her last entry ended mid-sentence. There were letters to fathers, brothers, children, and lovers. Some were playful, others full of worry. A few were formal, businesslike, talking of cargo and schedules. All of them, in their own way, were filled with life reminders that these were not just names on a list. They were people planning. Tomorrow. People who thought they still had time. Reading these words now is like hearing whispers through history. Ghosts leaning close to speak one last truth. And though they didn't know it, their words became more than just messages. They became memory.in. One recovered letter, a father wrote to his daughter, "You'll be proud of me when I return." He never did. But his letter was found, and read, and remembered. In that, he returned, if only a little, memory's gentle hand. The world didn't know how to mourn what it could not fully understand. In the early days, headlines told of numbers, names, causes, and blame. But slowly, very slowly, the world began to see more than facts. It began to see faces. Memorials were built. Flowers were laid. Books were written not just with details, but with devotion. Historians traveled to interview survivors, to visit graves, to piece together stories like broken porcelain. They treated every account with care, as if each one was a thread in a larger, sacred tapestry. In museums, a pair of shoes behind glass speaks louder than words. A child's toy, a torn ticket, a menu from the dining room. These objects are quiet, but not silent. They carry the weight of memory gently, like hands holding something fragile. Each anniversary brings more people who were never there, who never knew the names. And yet, they stand in silence. They read. They cry. They remember. Because the story, though old, still breathes. And now, when we speak of that night, we do not speak of a ship alone. We speak of people, of courage, of music played in the dark, of lifeboats and last words, of those who watched the stars for the last time, of those who returned to tell the tale and those who could not. Memory, when handled gently, becomes more than just looking back. It becomes a way forward, a way of saying, you were here. You mattered. In the hush that follows the last page, there is a promise that we will remember, that the voices which once echoed across the cold sea will never be lost again. Chapter 13, Wreck and Reverence. The Titanic lay hidden for over 70 years, buried not in sand or stone, but beneath layers of cold, crushing sea. For decades, it lived only in memories, in stories passed down, and in the fading black and white, photographs that never quite captured its size or sorrow. Then, in 1985, the wreck was found 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, where sunlight never touches and pressure squeezes even steel like folded cloth. The ship rested broken, but not gone. It was a place few thought would ever be reached. But when the cameras sent back the first ghostly images, the world held its breath. The bow stood proud, still pointed forward, as if continuing the journey. The stern, torn and scattered, told a different story, one of violence and collapse. The ship was not whole, but it was still unmistakably the Titanic. Around it lay the traces of lives interrupted. Porcelain dishes nestled in silt, shoes paired quietly side by side, luggage half buried, still locked. These were not just things. They were moments frozen. A comb, a mirror, a child's toy, all untouched by human hands for generations. Resting in water darker than any night, the sea had become a silent caretaker. In the stillness, it cradled the ship gently, as if recognizing its burden. Rust had crept across the hull like a slow, quiet tide, softening edges but not erasing them. Here, in the deep, time moved differently, and so the Titanic, once the height of human ambition, now slept beneath the weight of memory deeper than any grave dug by hand. Not forgotten, but unreachable. Not gone, but no longer part of the world above. Artifacts and ethics. As news of the wreck's discovery spread, excitement turned to curiosity, and curiosity soon stirred debate. Expeditions followed. Cameras, submersibles, even robotic arms were sent down to explore, to document, and sometimes to take. Artifacts were brought to the surface. A deck chair, a window frame, letters that had never been sent. Each item carried the salt of history and the weight of a name no longer spoken. Museums opened exhibits. People stood in silence before displays, staring through glass at things that once belonged to someone who never came home. For many, This was remembrance, a way to honor lives lost, to learn, to connect, to walk through a gallery and feel, for a moment, the echo of the past. But others saw something different, a kind of theft, a disruption of the quiet grave the ocean had made. Is it right to bring these things back? To lift from the seabed the belongings of the dead and place them under lights, behind labels. The question lingers in every exhibit hall. Does remembrance require touch? Or is it better to leave what the sea has kept? Some argue that preserving history is a kind of reverence, that by showing these artifacts, we ensure they are not forgotten. Others believe that true reverence means leaving the dead in peace where they fell, with only the ocean to keep them, and so the debate continues quiet, unresolved. What belongs to history? What belongs to memory? And what should be left? Alone? The deepest grave in time, the site of the wreck became more than just a point on a map. It became a place of mourning, a place of reverence. A cemetery not marked by marble, but by miles of water and a hush that no voice can reach. Here, the Titanic rests with over 1,500 souls. There are no headstones, no names etched in granite. Only the ship itself, broken but proud, surrounded by fragments of lives once lived. For some, visiting the wreck even remotely is like stepping into a sacred space. Submersibles move slowly, their lights dim, like candles carried through a cathedral. Operators speak in whispers. Some leave flowers. Others pause for moments of silence. The ocean listens, but does not speak. The site is protected now, recognized by international agreement as a memorial. It is not just wreckage. It is a grave, the deepest on earth. And like any place of rest, it asks for respect. The cold, crushing pressure of the deep has kept the site preserved, but time still reaches it. Rust, called rusticles by scientists, grows like vines over metal. The ship decays slowly, day by day, becoming less of what it was, but never less of what it means. And though the Titanic will one day return to the sea entirely, its steel softened into sediment, its edges dissolved into water, it will never truly vanish. Because in the deep grave, it holds more than metal. It holds a story, a lesson, a sorrow that touches every visitor, every viewer, every quiet heart that stands before a picture and imagines the silence below. The ocean holds its secrets even. Now, with maps and images, with records and reports, there are questions that remain unanswered. Details lost in the noise of panic, in the darkness of the sea, in the passing of time. Why did the ship strike where it did? Could more have been saved? What were the final moments like for those we'll never hear from? These questions drift, like currents felt but never fully seen, and perhaps there is something sacred in not knowing. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily. It holds them close, in currents and cold, in silence that stretches far beyond sound. For every answer we've uncovered, there are a dozen mysteries that remain. And maybe that's how it should be, because not all stories need to be complete to be understood. Not all truths fit into reports or timelines. Some exist only in the heart, in the way a name is spoken, in the tear that slips down a cheek, in the hush that follows when someone says, Titanic, the ship was once a symbol of pride, of human progress, of what we could build. Now it is a symbol of something gentler, of humility, of remembrance, of the line between dreams and disaster, between what we plan and what the world allows. And so, as the wreck continues its slow descent into memory, we watch, we listen, we wonder. The sea still holds what we may never know. But that's all right. Some stories aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be held in silence, in reverence, in peace. Chapter 14, Titanic in Story and Soul, As time passed and the waters calmed, the Titanic became more than a ship. It became a story passed from voice to voice, page to screen, generation to generation. What began as a tragedy at sea transformed into something larger, something that touched not just history, but imagination. Writers penned novels, each line shaped by sorrow and wonder. Some told true accounts, careful and quiet. Others wove fiction into fact, filling the empty spaces with invented names and whispered feelings. Poets wrote stanzas of loss, of stars that watched in silence, of hearts that sank but never surrendered. Then came the films. Black and white reels flickered in old theaters, showing wide decks, rushing water, and the final tilt toward darkness. Later, color returned to the tale. The 1997 film reached millions, not just through spectacle, but through love and fear, music and memory. It gave the Titanic faces some real, others imagined, but all anchored in emotion. The film didn't just show what happened. It reminded us how it felt. Children heard bedtime versions, softened by distance, shaped into parables of bravery and care. Songs were written, some mournful, some haunting. Artists painted it, stage plays performed it, museums built entire rooms around it, and so the Titanic became a legend, not because it was the only ship to sink, but because it sank into the human heart. The details may change with each telling, but the feeling remains a quiet ache, like the echo of a distant bell through fog. What we choose to remember memory is not always exact. It chooses, it reshapes, it adds warmth or removes shadows, depending on how we wish to feel. In the case of the Titanic, what we remember and what we forget tells us just as much about ourselves as it does about the ship. We remember the music, the band that played until the end, not because we know the exact notes, but because it comforts us to imagine beauty in the face of fear. We remember the lifeboats, the flickering lamps, the calm of the ocean as the ship disappeared. We talk of love stories born aboard, of acts of sacrifice, of men in tuxedos stepping aside, but memory can be selective. We often forget the third class passengers, the way their paths to safety were blocked. We speak less of the class divisions, the ignored warnings, the lives already lived in hardship before the sea took them. Sometimes we turn the Titanic into a symbol of elegance and romance, forgetting that it was also a story of inequality and error. The way we tell the story changes what it teaches us. Still, that's part of what keeps the Titanic alive. Not just in facts, but in feelings. In the choice to focus on courage or to question fairness. To admire design or remember failure. To say we must never forget, even if what we remember is colored by time. In the end, each retelling is a reflection not just of what happened, but of what we need from the story today. Safety, meaning, closure, or simply the sound of a story that keeps moving, like water over a grave, lessons carried forward from the silence of that cold night. Lessons began to rise slowly, carefully, but steadily. The iceberg left more than scars and steel. It carved change into policy, into practice, into the very way we think about safety at sea. After the Titanic, lifeboat regulations changed. No longer would they be treated as optional or just decorations on a beautiful ship. From then on, every passenger, every crew member would be counted, and a seat provided. Communication changed too. Radio operators now stayed on duty around the clock. Distress signals were standardized. The silence that cost lives that night would not be repeated without accountability. Ships began regular safety drills. Ice patrols were formed to watch the seas. International meetings were held. Laws were signed. The sea had spoken in the voice of disaster, and the world had listened, but the lessons weren't only technical. They were human. The the Titanic reminded the world that progress cannot outrun nature, that size and strength do not equal safety, that hubris, even in design, can be dangerous. It also taught of bravery, of calm under pressure, of people who helped others into boats, who sang hymns as the water rose, who lit the last lamps and held hands with strangers. These lessons didn't come written on scrolls or read aloud in halls. They came in grief, in headlines, in the faces of the rescued. And they stayed not as fear, but as resolve. The Titanic made the world pause. And from that stillness, a better path was drawn. Echoes in modern waters today, the ocean still carries ships across its vast, deep blue, but they move differently now. They move with memory. Modern vessels are equipped with technology that watches, listens, and learns. Lifeboats line their decks in plain view. Emergency drills are required. Routes are monitored. Ice warnings are not ignored. The Titanic's shadow stretches into these practices not with fear, but with quiet guidance. Captains speak with confidence, but also with caution. Designers dream big, but test their visions. Maritime laws carry footnotes written in the language of loss. Even passengers, boarding with excitement, walk past signs and symbols shaped by that long-ago voyage. We don't always think about it. We don't always say its name. But in the hum of engines, the flashing beacons, the lifeboat seats waiting in silence, the echo is there. And sometimes, when ships pass through cold waters beneath a star-filled sky, they turn slightly. Just slightly, as if listening, as if remembering, because the Titanic isn't just a shipwreck or a headline in an old paper. It's a story built into the rhythm of every voyage that followed. A story that says, be ready, be wise, be kind. And so, even now, the Titanic sails with us not through water, but through the choices we make, the care we give, and the stories we tell before sleep, when history feels closest and the sea seems to whisper truths we cannot forget. Chapter 15. A night that never ends. There are dates that pass unnoticed. Quiet pages in a calendar. Days we live without thought. But some dates never fade, they echo, year after year, not through numbers, but through feeling. April 14th is one of those nights. It was a Sunday, ordinary in many ways. Passengers dressed for dinner. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally so. The air, though cold, felt still like a breath held. Above, stars stretched across the night sky in clear silence, unblinking, as if watching. The Titanic moved steadily through the North Atlantic, her engines deep in rhythm. From the decks, couples walked in quiet conversation. Children had gone to sleep. A few stayed up reading. Some stood at the rails, gazing out at the dark water. They didn't know they were looking into history. An alarm sounded. No strange movements stirred the ship. Just the steady hum of power, the soft pull of speed, the gentle sound of waves parting. A night like many others, but this one would remain. In that stillness, time seemed to pause. The world above slept. The world below prepared. When we remember April 14th now, we don't just recall the numbers. We feel the hush before the break, the heartbeat before it stumbles. We remember the quiet, the grace of unknowing, the final hours of a floating world that had not yet fractured. And in every retelling, every anniversary, we return to that moment when the stars watched, the sea glistened, and the ship, for one last time, sailed forward into the night. Those who stayed behind as panic spread and lifeboats filled. Not everyone ran. Some stood still. Others turned back. There were those who knew in quiet certainty that their place was not in a boat, but in a final act of duty, of dignity, of love, the engineers, deep in the belly of the ship, kept working. They knew what was coming. They felt the tilt. Before anyone else. But still they stayed. They fed the boilers, powered the lights, held back the water for as long as they could. Without them, the ship would have gone dark far sooner. Their hands kept the decks lit, the pumps running, and hope alive for just a little longer. The musicians gathered their instruments and played. Not for applause, not to distract, but because they could. Because music, even then, offered something. Still and human. As voices cried and water rose, the notes floated up calm, gentle, brave. They played until the end. There were mothers who placed children into lifeboats and stepped back. Fathers who kissed their families goodbye and watched the distance grow. Strangers who offered their seats to others, who locked arms with the lonely, who gave their life not in battle, but in choice. No monuments name them all. No film can show each face. But in every story told, that they're not shouting, not grand, but steady, they are the quiet heroes. The ones who didn't fight fate, but met it with grace. Who filled their final minutes not with fear, but with something softer, something we still feel when we speak their names. A farewell in still waters today, if you travel far enough into the North Atlantic to where coordinates once pointed, and radios once called, you'll find only water. Endless, quiet water. No trace of steel or smoke. No lights. Just the sea, deep and undisturbed. But for those who know the story, something lingers. The moonlight seems softer here, as if remembering. The surface, though moved by wind and tide, sometimes feels still. Beneath, 2.5 miles down, the remains rest in silence. But above, the ocean shimmers with memory. Flowers are dropped from ships. Names are spoken in hushed tones. And some visitors, standing at railings, do not speak at all. They just watch. They listen. To the water. To the quiet. It's not the ship they see. Not really. It's the lives. The choices. The last embraces. The lost letters. The gloved hands waving from decks now gone. The sound of violins fading into cold air. The footsteps. The waiting. The Titanic's grave is not only beneath the sea. It floats to an air, in light, in the moments we pause and remember. It is a farewell written across the waves. Never. Finished, and as long as the ocean moves, as long as the night sky opens wide, that farewell will never vanish. It will drift gentle, patient, waiting for someone to listen again, drifting to sleep. And now, dear listener, we come to the end, not just the end of a ship's journey, but of a story told, soft and slow, across the quiet of a night. A story that began with hope, moved through sorrow, and settled into memory. The Titanic still sails not on water, but in us, in how we remember, in how we learn, in how we listen. So let it sink now, not in disaster, but in peace. Let the ship descend once more, not through waves, but through thought. Down past the noise, past the headlines, into stillness. The lifeboats have drifted far. The stars are high above. The ocean sleeps. And you may rest too. Close your eyes. Breathe. Let the ship go. Let the sea take it and drift. Gently. Into sleep.